Well, we've been talking about Australia's record high immigration rate for a number of months now, and it's been thrust back into the spotlight this week after a Liberal senator wrote to the Prime Minister calling for a proper community debate about our population issues. Joining me tonight to discuss his call for reform is WA Liberal Senator Dean Smith. Thanks for your time, Senator. Great to have you on the show. I know from a number of ministers that I've spoken to off the record that none of them are prepared to go public. This is an issue that is being debated internally in the Liberal Party, in the National Party. There are a number of MPs in Cabinet, senior MPs in Cabinet, who have tried to get this on the government's agenda. It has not succeeded to date, but it's certainly one of those front-of-mind issues for ordinary Australians. What's led you to speak out at this time? Why now?
Well, I think there are two things fundamentally, Peter, that have led me to the position that I've now taken. The first is, as a senator, I get to travel around regional Western Australia very extensively, but I also get to travel around other Australian cities and have been able to see for myself, but also hear from other Australians about how population pressures are top of mind for them. Then, of course, secondly, our country is facing a very historic milestone. In the first week of August, we will tip over the 25 million people mark. I mean, that's a historic and important milestone. And I think that that anniversary is a very neat way to give some community expression to this very, very important issue of population growth, how we are preparing for population growth, how we are predicting our population growth, and what we can do to maintain a very, very high level of public endorsement around our immigration policies and, of course, more broadly, around our population policies.
OK, well, you're talking about this 25 million mark that will hit, experts say, in August. In 2002, Peter Costello said it would take us 40 years to reach the 25 million mark. In fact, it only took us 16 years. You're saying we need an inquiry so that we have public endorsement for our immigration policy. Well, right now, the majority of Australians say our rate is too high. The majority of Australians, in poll after poll, it's not just News Poll, it's Essential Poll, Ipsos polls, other polls as well. There was a recent Lowy report that had a 14% jump this year on last in people's perceptions about our immigration rate, and that 14% jump was in the it's far too high category. If you've got all of this evidence from Australians, and the evidence actually is fact-based, because Peter Costello said it'd be 40 years in 2002, it was only 16, it is growing faster than ever, people don't like it, why aren't the politicians listening?
Well, that's a good point, and I'll come to that in a second. The challenge for a parliamentarian is always to discern what is anecdotal, what are the things that get said to them randomly, but then what is a more reliable body of evidence, what is the data, if you like, to then make some informed decisions. What my observation is, Peter, that over the last few days we've seen a very clear demonstration from Australians, from commentators, indeed from the CEO of Infrastructure Australia, that population issues and immigration issues are important enough to have a national discussion, to have a national conversation. And I think that the 25 million mark does provide a really neat opportunity to do that. My concern would be that if parliamentarians don't respond to these issues in a timely, in a considered way, that gap, if you like, between community anxiety, community expectation and what politicians are talking about, when that widens, you'll get a very significant decrease in that level of public confidence. And you're quite right, it was the Lowy 2018 community survey that really pricked my ears in terms of, why it was an important time now to discuss this issue. If I've read that report correctly, they've talked about a 14-point drop in public confidence when it comes to immigration policies. Now, I just don't think that now is the time to put our head in the sand. Now is the time to engage in a national discussion. And the country is ready for it, and the country is mature enough to be able to do that.
Look, I agree with the maturity point. I mean, in the past, anyone who wants to talk about the rate of immigration, and it's not immigration per se, it's not should we have immigration or not, it's how many do we have, and should we have a pause, let's say, to let all the other costs like infrastructure and housing catch up to where the population is. But when people have tried to raise these issues in the past, they've been called xenophobes, they've been called racists. You talk about a gap in the debate. I mean, my political view is every time there is a gap, that gap or that vacuum will be filled by some less sensible elements other than, government or opposition trying to act in Australia's long-term interests. I guess the worry in that Lowy report for me was that 41% of Australians are saying they think the fabric of our country is under pressure or under strain from immigration. So it's not just the number, Senator Smith, it's also what sort of migrant is coming to Australia and what sort of Australia is being created by these inflows of 240,000 year on year.
Well, as someone eloquently put it to me today, it's about the heart and mind of migrants that are coming to Australia. It's absolutely about the rate of growth. But significantly, Peter, it's also about how that population gets dispersed across Australia, because the evidence points very, very clearly to the great bulk of that population growth happening in Sydney and Melbourne. Now, I would argue that if population growth has virtues, then those virtues should be shared across the whole country. And if there are challenges, if there are risks to population growth, then we need to prepare and plan for those, and they should not fall on one group of people or one or two cities. And it's interesting to note, Peter, that in the Shaping the Nation report, in the government's own report that was released in April this year, a Treasury and Department of Home Affairs report, it makes the case that we need to keep alive to the issues surrounding population growth if we are to maintain and to enjoy the virtues of population growth.
If you look at government policy, and you've been around a long time, you chair a number of big committees, you chair the Finance, the Public Accounts Committee, which is one of the most powerful in the Parliament, but you've been around plenty of other committees as well. You understand there are teams of bureaucrats in Canberra and in the States as well that plan every aspect of government expenditure and every aspect of government policy. You could drown in policy documents in that place if you wanted to. Yet there is not one document that is Australia's population plan. We've got a plan for everything, but no plan for population. You want an inquiry. You've talked about it being modelled on a recent British UK parliamentary inquiry. What did that inquiry find, and why do you think this idea might work in Australia?
Well, just to take your viewers back a step, following the referendum in the United Kingdom on entry or exit from the European Union, following that very, very contentious issue, the United Kingdom Parliament itself established a select committee to examine into issues around immigration and population growth. My reading of the situation, my reading of the reports is that was a process that was widely endorsed across the United Kingdom. It did give ordinary English, Scots and Welsh people an opportunity to put their views, as well as community leaders and business people. But a key recommendation of that report, one that I was particularly drawn to, it said that if you don't stay ahead of these issues, if you don't stay ahead of the misinformation, if you don't stay ahead of the misconceptions, then that is when you start to find yourself in a great deal of bother when it comes to sort of maintaining public acceptance and social cohesion around your immigration policies. So being a keen student of these things, I thought, well, that's a pretty powerful demonstration that a parliamentary committee can work. But you're right, from my own experience, I've seen parliamentary committees work at their best. They do bring out a variety of views, but I've also seen parliamentarians working at their best, Peter. And the idea that you might be able to establish a national blueprint that has the broadest possible consensus, I don't think is unachievable. We've seen it in the recent past. But I'd also say this, that often politicians are criticised for being too short-term. Well, let's throw out the challenge and choose some parliamentarians to put their mind to be more medium, longer-term focused.
I guess one of the issues is if the report comes out to say Australia should wind back the rate of immigration in some way, the government has to be prepared to cop the findings of their own report. Now, the Prime Minister is a big Australia man. Scott Morrison earlier in the year decried any suggestion you could reduce immigration without a significant hit to the budget. When Tony Abbott talked about returning back to the Howard level numbers, Morrison said that's a $5 billion hit. Now, only last week we had Peter Dutton say administratively over the last year he's been able to reduce the population increases in incoming to the country by about 20,000, and I didn't hear Scott Morrison saying, well, thank you very much, Immigration Minister, that's going to cost the budget $1 billion. He didn't say that. So do you think if the report was to find that we should slow the rate of immigration, your Prime Minister would listen to your report?
Well, the report can't make it up. The report can't make a recommendation like that up. So if that is the conclusion that a parliamentary report comes to, then that conclusion will be based on evidence that's not just available to cabinet ministers, not just available to bureaucrats in Canberra, but that is available to every Australian, and that can be scrutinised and contested by every Australian that has an interest in these matters. So when a committee report comes out that has broad consensus, I think it's more likely that governments will test that, or if governments do try to refute it, what they'll try to do is provide new evidence in order to refute that. So I think getting a very clear, substantial body of evidence on the table that is available to everybody who is interested in this issue, I think is not just a good starting point, I think it's a fundamental starting point, and one that every Australian has a right to expect.
Dean Smith, you are no political novice, right? You've been around a long time outside of politics in the machine, and now obviously as a senator. Luke Foley was out there on immigration. Bob Carr's been out there on immigration. I've listened carefully to the language of Bill Shorten. He's on the sticky paper about immigration after saying for many months it's not an issue. Now, when your opponents who live in the suburbs and represent the suburbs where there is pretty heavy congestion are waking up that this is an issue that people on the left are talking about as much as people in your own constituency, surely, even if the government doesn't like it in a policy sense because of Morrison's budget arguments, they've got to be mugged by the political reality that Labor's going to move on this issue if the government just stands still.
Well, I'd agree with that the challenge for the coalition is not to be asleep at the wheel. The challenge for the coalition is not to have its head in the sand on this issue. I have seen this in the last few days, the real strong community response and interest, genuine community response and interest in this. But I might add, if I could just speak politically for one moment, Peter, when we talk about economic management, that's a coalition strength. When we talk about regional development, that is a coalition strength. When we talk about infrastructure spending, that is a coalition strength. So why wouldn't we want to wrap these things up in a very convincing, very credible population policy that would provide people with a level of security and confidence around these issues into the longer term?